Hi guys, welcome to another video. It has been a long time. We're going to talk about the standards of practice and feeding being a PSW and what you are supposed to do. This video is actually going to focus on just feeding tubes. So a person on a feeding tube may be taken care of by a PSW. There's a couple different types of tube feeding methods. It could be done by gravity or by a pump. So the pumps are enteral pump feedings. Or they're the gastric system, so they'll either be a tube in the stomach or they'll have a feeding tube down their mouth. The person who's responsible for adding the formula into the feeding tubes is actually the nurse, but it can be delegated to a PSW. There's only one type of tube a PSW cannot be delegated to help with or do. We cannot help with a nasogastric tube. We're allowed to help with the Dobhoff, a J-tube, or a PEG tube. The PSW has to understand the procedures of the feeding tube, and the PSW should also be aware of any complications that can arise from being on a feeding tube. So know your scope of practice. You can't just help with a feeding tube right away. You need to be delegated. Not only delegated, but you need to be monitored. Even if the RHP is comfortable with the PSW and feels they know how to perform the task, they should still be the one to perform the initial feeding. So that's when like a new order is coming in from the physician because it's different from the last. The PSW is in charge of monitoring the insertion site, so the outside, the external part of the skin and how it appears. Make sure the tube's integrity is good and make sure the tube's in the correct position. PSWs are responsible for cleaning around the insertion site and making sure they're, oh my gosh, I'm stuttering. The PSW is in charge of monitoring that site for any signs of infection, or if there's any signs or symptoms of a fever, you need to report that. If there's reflux and they're vomiting, make sure you let your nurse know that this is happening. The directions for feeding are clearly outlined in the plan of care. You must properly position the client before every feeding. If the person's not tolerating the feeding, the PSW should know how to stop the machine and let the nurse know. If you notice any blockages in the feeding tube, make sure you report that to the nurse as well. Basically, the nurses are responsible for flushing it. If the tube is broken, it might have to be replaced. They might have to go to the hospital to have that done, or they can do that in the nursing home. I would say all feeding tube machines are pretty easy to learn from, so if you're not comfortable with a new one, just ask a nurse how to show you a couple times so you know how to turn it on and off. If you're ever needing to start and stop it, which as a PSW, you need to do that quite a bit, so I suggest you learn it right away. Every time you take somebody for a bath or you get them up out of bed, you have to disconnect their feeding tube so they don't get all tangled. When you're dressing them, you have to disconnect it. So it's something that you should know over time when you have clients who have feeding tubes. And that's basically all for feeding tubes, guys. I'm gonna make 2 other videos on food and fluids at the end of life for like palliative care. And I'm also gonna make another video on the dining experience of residents in long-term care / retirement. So stay tuned for those videos, and I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Goodbye.